And gun violence prevention advocates say the issue has been outshadowed by other topics ahead of the election despite an ongoing epidemic. The Gun Violence Archive reports at least 134 people have been killed in 148 mass shootings across the U.S. since the first debate between President Biden and former President Trump. March for Our Lives co-founder and Parkland shooting survivor David Hogg joins me now for more on this. David, thank you for coming on. It's one of those issues that I wish you didn't have to be here to discuss. But let's talk about the polls, because they show that gun violence is not one of the top issues for voters this year. Why do you think that is?
There's a lot of issues going on, and unfortunately, I think many voters don't have the privilege of being single-issue voters anymore, especially young people who have to worry about dying from a school shooting today or dying of climate change tomorrow. We are not a single-issue voting generation. We care about all of these issues at the same time, so I think in some ways polls can't accurately assess it. But what we do know is when there are shootings that the public support for stronger gun laws does go up, and we have seen some meaningful change over the past several years with the passage of the first gun law in 30 years at the federal level.
Now, some advocates have criticized the Biden-Harris administration for not doing enough to stop or lower gun violence. What's your response to that?
I think my response to that is that the biggest obstacle that we have to deal with isn't the administration so much as it is a divided Congress that we have to deal with, and a filibuster that makes it so that even when the majority of senators say do support something like strengthening gun laws, it's practically impossible for us to pass that because of the filibuster and the fact that we need 60 votes to get any meaningful legislation done. But the Senate is disproportionately representative of, land rather than people.
Now, Harris has faced criticism for making promises that she may not be able to deliver, particularly with the divided government, as you say. So what more do you think needs to be done, especially without the full control of Congress?
Well, I think there's tons that the executive branch can do and has done, whether that's the creation of the first ever Office of Gun Violence Prevention at the White House that has helped to coordinate the federal government's response to gun violence. I think it's important that people know that billions of dollars have been allocated to help fight gun violence ever since the Uvalde massacre happened, and Congress actually did something about guns for the first time in 30 years, where they expanded background checks for people under the age of 21 and put billions of dollars into school safety, mental health, and community safety programs. What that Office of Gun Violence Prevention has done is ensure that states around the country know which money is actually available for them from the federal government for them to use to help combat gun violence. And what we've seen is a double-digit reduction in gun homicides around the country over the past 3 years.
You're also the co-founder of Leaders We Deserve, which works to elect young candidates and stresses the importance of state house races. Our latest poll shows more men say they support Trump, more women say they support Harris, and the disparity is even more significant when it comes to young voters, that gender gap. Why do you think that is? Why are we seeing such a larger gender gap among young voters this time around? And what are you hearing from young voters about that?
Well, one, I think a lot of it comes down to the role that social media has played, especially since COVID, of driving a lot of the male loneliness epidemic. And I think it's not so much that a lot of younger men necessarily disagree with the principles of the Democratic Party or the general liberal agenda, whether that's racial equality, and ending gun violence, or taxing the rich more. I think it's more that they would rather be around people who they don't feel like they have to walk on eggshells around, even if they disagree with them most, than being around people who they do agree with but feel like they're going to be judged by a lot of the time, along with the fact that, frankly, there's a taboo, and there has been for a long time within the Democratic Party, of talking about what we're doing for young men, and it's understandable, because so often talking about what we're doing for men is to the exclusion of women, obviously. But we need to start having that conversation and realizing that compassion is not a zero-sum game. We need to simultaneously address the mental health epidemic that young men are facing, while also addressing the fact that we still have issues with the gender pay gap, for example, and don't fully have gender equality yet. So I think what we're seeing, though, is some potential movement, too. I was just at UPenn the other day when I was talking to a lot of young men, many of whom who were voting for Trump, but one of them that was undecided that I got to talk to, I was able to convince over the course of a 5-minute conversation. And what ended up convincing him was talking about the work that Vice President Harris did with President Biden to pass the first federal gun law in 30 years after Uvalde, that since has prevented over 1,000 high-risk individuals from buying guns like the AR-15 because of the expanded background check process that law implemented. And so often, younger voters just don't know what actually has been done from them, whether that's on guns or the largest climate spending in human history.
So what's your message to the next president of the United States, whoever it may be?
my next message is whoever it is to listen to young people, because ultimately we're going to live with the consequences of your choices far more than anybody else does, because we have the most life ahead of us. And we need a government that's responsive to the fact that it is harder to own a house than it really has been in decades in the United States. It's harder to achieve the American dream. It's harder to pay for our health care, and it's harder to graduate from college without debt than it ever has been. And we need leadership that is actually responsive to that in the first place. And frankly, if we don't get that, what I'm doing with Leaders We Deserve, my organization to help elect more young people, is realizing if we have a government that won't address the issues that face young people, I think it's time to change who's in government by electing some more young people like Congressman Frost, who came from March for Our Lives and is now the youngest member of Congress, the first member of March for Our Lives ever in Congress. And that's what we're doing at Leaders We Deserve in state houses and in Congress around the country to help elect this generation, so they bring that long-term perspective of how do we end gun violence now and address climate change tomorrow and all the issues that we face in between. If anybody would like to learn more about that, they can go to leaderswedeserve.com.
All right, March for Our Lives and Leaders We Deserve co-founder David Hogg. David, thank you.
Thank you.